It was supposed to be a ghost story, just a stupid internet rumor that circulated in schools, until the day it wasn't. Not wasn't in the way that ghost stories stop being scary. Wasn't in the way that something fictional leaves a stain on reality that never fully washes out. Japan. The country where everything works. The trains, the systems, the silence. If you've ever assumed that a society this ordered, this functional, this watched, if you've ever assumed it couldn't produce a hidden population of over 1 million people who have effectively ceased to exist within it, whisper. This investigation will make you question that assumption from the ground up. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Japan's most infamous internet horror story became inseparable from something that happened in a real school, and why the number that appeared on your screen just now is the real story underneath. But to understand how a ghost story becomes fact, we need to start with what Japan built around the people it decided not to see.
So why did a children's horror legend end up connected to something far darker than fiction? The answer lies in a structure that was never designed to protect the people inside it. Let's be precise about what we're talking about, because precision matters here. According to Japan's Cabinet Office, not a fringe study, not a think tank estimate, 1.46 million working-age people in Japan are socially isolated. The definition? No meaningful social contact outside their household for at least 6 months. They are not hospitalized. They are not in institutions. They are simply absent from the world around them.
What makes this specific to Japan? In the United States, in Germany, in South Korea, social isolation is measured as a mental health crisis, a policy failure, something that requires intervention. In Japan, the framework barely exists. According to a 2023 Kyoto News survey, 39% of people living in Japan say they feel lonely at times. Nearly 4 in 10. And that figure doesn't even capture the hardened cases, the people who have passed loneliness into something more structural. Something with a name. Hikikomori. The word translates roughly as pulling inward. But translation doesn't capture the mechanism. What hikikomori describes is a person who had withdrawn so completely from social life that normal institutions, schools, workplaces, welfare systems, have stopped being able to reach them. They exist. They are simply not findable.
Here's what strikes me. In most countries, a hidden population of 1.46 million people would constitute a national emergency. In Japan, it has constituted a policy footnote for the better part of 3 decades. And this is where a ghost story becomes relevant. Whisper. Because Japan also has a genre of horror, specifically about being trapped inside a system that no one sees. And the most famous example of that genre, the one that school children passed around on diskettes and early flash websites, is called the Red Room Curse. Before we get to what happened the day it stopped being fiction, you need to understand the shape of the silence it was living inside. But what happened next, the moment when the story and the reality touched, is something that the Japanese media covered and then quietly stepped back from, because it raised questions no one was comfortable answering. To understand why 1.46 million people can disappear in the most orderly society on Earth, you need to go back to what that order was built on.
Japan's post-war social architecture, constructed through the 1950s and reaching full form by the 1970s, was designed around a specific unit: the productive worker embedded in a company, embedded in a neighborhood, embedded in a community. The five-person neighborhood group system, or goningumi, had roots going back to the Edo period, a method of collective accountability where neighbors were responsible for each other's behavior. By the post-war period, that had evolved into something subtler, an expectation of social visibility. You were seen. Your children were seen. You showed up. The unspoken rule was this: if you stopped showing up, the community would notice. The system was self-policing. Visibility was the price of belonging, and belonging was the price of safety.
Sound familiar? This same structure is exactly why its absence produces what we're seeing now. Because somewhere in the 1990s, the machine began to fail. Straining. The lost decade, Japan's prolonged economic stagnation didn't just destroy companies. It destroyed the social architecture that companies had replaced traditional community structures with. When lifetime employment stopped being a guarantee, the implicit social contract underneath it cracked. People who had built their entire identity around institutional belonging found themselves without an institution. And without the institution, there was no framework for being seen. Pause for 1.2 seconds. I've been sitting with this structural reading for several weeks now. What changed for me was a footnote in a 2019 Ministry of Health report, page 47, buried under the aggregate statistics, that showed the fastest growing hikikomori demographic wasn't teenagers.
It was men in their 40s and 50s, the men who had been inside the broken machine longest. That wound from the 1990s never fully healed, and into that wound, Japan's internet arrived. In the early 2000s, a specific genre of Japanese internet horror, creepypasta before the word existed in English, began circulating in schools. It traveled on diskettes, on early websites, through email chains. These stories shared a common structure. A pop-up appears, and you cannot close it. A message arrives, and you cannot ignore it. You are trapped inside a system that will not release you. The Red Room curse was the most famous of these. A pop-up appears on your screen. It asks, "Do you like the Red Room?" Anyone who sees it ends up dead. The walls of their room painted in their own blood. It circulated among school children the way playground rumors always do. Half joke, half genuine fear.
Until 2004, when a case involving a junior high school student in Sasebo, Nagasaki, brought the Red Room curse out of folklore and into news coverage. The story became culturally linked to a real act of violence in a real school. The exact nature of that connection was disputed. The media was careful to note correlation rather than cause. But the damage to the legend's status as merely fiction was permanent. The Red Room had touched reality, and nobody wanted to look at what it had been saying all along. Everything we've covered so far points to one conclusion, except it's wrong. Or rather, it's incomplete in a way that makes it more disturbing, not less. Here's the part most coverage of hikikomori stops before reaching. And it's the part that changes everything.
The Red Room Curse described a system you cannot exit, a pop-up you cannot close, a message that finds you regardless of what you do. And Japan has 1.46 million people living inside a version of exactly that. Consider what the Cabinet Office data actually shows. According to Japan's 2023 government survey, approximately 2.05% of people aged 15 to 39 and 2.02% of people aged 40 to 64 meet the isolation definition. That symmetry is the most disturbing part. This is not a youth problem that people age out of. This is a life stage agnostic structural condition. Young people entering a social system that cannot hold them. Middle-aged people expelled from an economic system that had been holding them. Both groups arriving at the same invisible address.
Think about that for a moment. A country where nearly the same percentage of 22-year-olds and 52-year-olds have disappeared from social contact. That does not happen by accident. That is a feature, not a bug of a system built around conditional belonging. And then there is kodokshi, the lonely death. The term describes people who die alone and are not discovered for days, weeks, sometimes months. In 2024 and 2025, Japanese media coverage of kodokshi deaths reached a frequency that suggested something close to normalization. One report documented a 68-year-old woman in a Tokyo apartment complex who was not found for 8 days. 8 days. In a building where she had lived for 11 years, surrounded by neighbors whose lives had passed alongside hers without ever truly intersecting. Reading through the Japanese reporting on this case, the original Yomiuri coverage, not the English summary, what I found was not shock. The neighbors expressed sadness. They expressed guilt. But not surprise. The dominant word in the commentary was shikata ga nai. It cannot be helped. That phrase, that particular cultural permission to stop expecting intervention, that is the mechanism. Call it what it is. A social architecture that has learned to process human disappearance as ordinary. The system is not broken. The system is functioning exactly as it was built to function, silently absorbing the people it cannot use, and producing no alarm signal when they stop being visible. And the numbers don't stay abstract for long.
Behind the 1.46 million is a man who stopped answering his phone in 2021. He is 49. He worked for 23 years at a logistics company that restructured. He has not left his apartment in 18 months. He is not a statistic yet. He is a person who has not yet been found. The Red Room Curse asked, "Do you like the Red Room?" The real question Japan has been asking for 30 years is quieter and more patient. How long does it take before anyone notices you're gone? And there's one piece of evidence that proves this is structural, not individual. A document buried inside Japan's own welfare infrastructure that the government's response has never fully addressed. I want to show you what Japanese people themselves are saying about this, because it's not what you'd expect.
When the Cabinet Office released the 1.46 million figure in 2023, the Japanese internet didn't erupt. It absorbed it. On Yahoo Japan's comment section, the reaction pattern was something closer to resigned recognition then alarm. One user wrote, "I'm not surprised. I've suspected my next-door neighbor hasn't left in months. I don't know what to do about it." Another, "The government creates a survey, publishes a number, and then does nothing. We've seen this cycle before." A third comment, and the one that stayed with me longest, "The saddest part is that the 1.46 million themselves probably don't see themselves as a crisis. They see themselves as quietly managing." The dominant emotional register is what Japanese social researchers call akirame, a kind of active acceptance, not quite defeat, but the decision to stop expecting the situation to change. It is a remarkably different reaction from what the same story produces outside Japan.
On Reddit, a thread discussing the cabinet office figures drew nearly 4,000 upvotes. The most upvoted comment read, roughly paraphrased, "How is this not a national emergency? If 1.46 million people went missing in the US, it would be on the front page every day." Meanwhile, in the comments of a documentary covering hikikomori, one viewer wrote, "I've been watching Japanese society documentaries for years. What strikes me is that Westerners are horrified, and Japanese viewers seem tired." Notice the difference. Western observers reach for the language of emergency. Japanese commenters have already made peace with the number, not because they don't care, but because the expectation of institutional response has been withdrawn through repetition of its absence.
This gap is not a cultural quirk.
It is the gap between a population that still believes their systems will respond and a population that has learned, empirically, that theirs will not. And honestly, reading through these comments, the Japanese ones especially, what I kept thinking was, the horror legend got it right. The Red Room curse described a pop-up you cannot close, a system that will not respond to your input. And here is a real survey confirming that over 1 million people are living inside exactly that architecture. The legend was a metaphor that turned out to be a map. I've spent several months going through the original Japanese welfare reporting on this. And what I found in the gap between the government's stated response and its actual resource allocation changed how I see the entire structure.
Now here's the part that most documentaries about Japan completely ignore, and it changes everything. Why does Japan specifically produce this phenomenon at this scale? 3 layers. And you need all 3 to understand why fixing one doesn't touch the others. Layer 1, cultural. Japan's social architecture runs on tatemae, the presented self, and hone, the interior reality. The two are expected to remain separate. You perform functionality. What happens behind closed doors is your own. This cultural permission to maintain a functioning exterior while the interior deteriorates is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The horror of social disappearance in Japan is partly that it is structurally legible. People recognize the early stages in themselves and in neighbors, and the cultural framework says that is private. Do not intrude.
Layer 2. Structural. Japan's welfare system was not designed for the post-employment society. The support infrastructure for hikikomori, which does exist in the form of local yorisoi support centers and government consultation services, is catastrophically underfunded relative to the scale of need. According to the Frontiers in Public Health Research tracking isolation during and after the COVID-19 period, social isolation worsened significantly in Japan during 2020-2021, and the recovery rate was slower than comparable countries.
The infrastructure was not built to respond at scale because the policy assumption was always that the family unit would absorb the person first. Layer 3. Psychological. Sociologist Naoki Kondo of the University of Tokyo, who has studied social isolation and health outcomes in Japan extensively, describes what happens to long-term isolated individuals as a form of learned helplessness specific to high-shame, high-conformity social environments.
The longer a person is outside the visible social structure, the more impossible re-entry feels, because the shame of having been absent compounds with every week that passes. The system doesn't just allow disappearance. It makes return progressively harder. This is where Western analysis of Japan often gets it wrong. It treats hikikomori as a failure of individual will. It is a structural output of a system that provides no low-stakes re-entry points for people who have fallen out of its primary structures. The door doesn't just close, it locks from the outside. The numbers tell you everything. 1.46 million people. 3 decades of documentation. A welfare response that has never matched the scale it is responding to. This is not oversight. This is policy.
So, why hasn't Japan treated this as the emergency the numbers describe? The answer has less to do with government failure and more to do with a very specific decision about whose disappearance the system is designed to notice.
The Red Room curse asked one question, over and over, to everyone who found it. Do you like the Red Room? There was no correct answer. Saying yes, saying no, the legend said the ending was the same regardless of how you responded. Straining. The trap wasn't in the question. The trap was in the system that had already decided your answer before you gave it. Japan's 1.46 million socially isolated people did not choose their situation in a vacuum. Cold fury, sharp and intense. The system around them made certain choices about what constitutes community, about who is visible, about what triggers a response long before any individual chose to close their curtains and stop answering the phone.
The Red Room became infamous because it felt true to something. Not because it predicted a specific event, but because the architecture it described, a system you cannot exit, a message you cannot refuse, a response that will not come, matched a structure that millions of people were already living inside, quietly, without a name for it. Japan has since named it. The government has a minister for loneliness. The surveys are published. The numbers are public. And the number keeps growing. If this is the kind of story that you've never seen covered like this before, where the horror legend and the government data and the human cost are part of the same investigation, Shadow Japan puts one of these together every week. The next one has been in progress for a long time, and it might be the most structurally uncomfortable thing we've covered yet.
But before I go, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually think about it, not just scroll past it. How many people have to disappear into silence before a society notices the shape of the whole? And when a society does notice, when the surveys are published, when the ministry exists, when the number is public, what does it mean that the number still grows? Is the system failing to respond?
Or is this the response? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And I mean that, especially the ones that push back on how I framed this, because that's where the real conversation happens.